I think a widespread attitude of rationality sometimes finds itself in bed with an attitude of rationalism because of a certain superficial similarity between them.
Yeah, we've seen that more recently. But that still was enough to create and motivate this European elite to be famished for new ideas.
Wow.
They would have become scared by that after a fashion.
They did become scared. They did become scared when Burke came along, and the reactionary thinkers of the early 19th century came along. The return to traditional religion. Murray?
And what was it in the American context that made it more difficult for Kantianism to take hold?
Well, the great fathers of the country they had not actually gotten to grapple intellectually with anyone beyond Hume and Burke, I suppose, after Locke. And then a whole generation came along consisting of Andrew Jackson. And I mean, these people were not on the same level at all. I can't imagine Andrew Jackson reading the Critique of Pure Reason and saying we must modify some of our basic ideas. I think that somewhat the decline in intellectual standards actually helped keep Kant out for a while. That's one of those accidental factors of history, which sometimes make history less Hegelian than we might otherwise expect.
There's a book on the Constitution, a monograph by a fellow named Corwin, and the last page, he makes the connection that Kant destroyed freedom in the world. Just a blank statement. And it was 1776, the crucial date. The Declaration of Independence. Just at the moment that Kant's, the moment where Kant's influence had a chance.
Well, that was the year that the Critique of Pure Reason.
Right. And he makes that connection, and he doesn't go further, but the implication is that in the United States, as well as in Europe, the fall of the original ideals is due to Kant's influence.
It's due to what?
Kant's influence here as well.
Peacock makes the same connection at the end of chapter 5, beyond his parallels, the nation of the American. I mean, the very last sentence is that, things weren't boding well for our little republic here, because at the time that our founding fathers were writing the Declaration of Independence, Kant was publishing the Critique of Pure Reason. The next chapter goes on to discuss the influence of Kant on Emerson and transcendentalists. And
pragmatism.
Yeah, the Transcendental movement, it was heavily influenced by Coleridge, who was influenced by Hegel and the German Romantics. So there was this, the influence of Kant quickly came back here, if you would accept that he was linked at all with the German thinkers in that way. It was an influence not on the politicians per se, but on the writers, literati.
It took a while. Oliver Wendell Holmes was, I think, the first major political figure who adopted Kantian and Hegelian ideas.
When you were talking about Rawls before, the original position, and his claim that this is a move towards you employing the concept of the noumenal self, if not describing it.
He mentioned it.
Yes, right. It seemed that he was making a move there in which, once again, he's describing the indescribable. And think of Kant making these claims over and over again about what we cannot know about the numinal self, but then always taking one step back from that and saying, on the other hand, surely there is some claim, some expectation of what each numinal self is or has in relation to all other numinal selves. My question is there anybody along this line of ancestry here who ever comes out and says flat out, consistently, the numinal self must exist, we don't know what it is, all we know is that it is, and we have nothing whatsoever further to say about it, or to claim on its behalf? Because they all seem to be, sooner or later, they make this card trick of, I can say something about it, convenient to my political goals.
Is there anyone who just has a noumenal self without any philosophical implications whatsoever? It's just a conclusion.
Philosophical black hole.
Yeah. I've never heard of anyone who
They all have hidden agenda.
they all have hidden agenda which for the role which the noumenal self is going to play. That's a good point. Yeah. And it's got to be noumenal, because we can't allow that role to be played by everyday, simple, everyday things and interests and our own survival and our own happiness. We can't allow that. So there must be a quasi-supernatural being to whom we owe a loyalty in the name of which we must sacrifice our empirical selves.
Go back to the Rawls. Rawls, this quest for so-called fairness requires that this original position be totally, completely divorced from any goal-directed action, any personal goal-directed action. And it seems to me that's the common denominator, linking all these guys. That in order to, the repository of real values has no purpose within anything a human being can relate to selfishly on this earth.
Oh yes, absolutely. Kant would thank you for that statement, I think.
Thank him too.
He somewhere distinguishes between what he calls values and what he calls worth. Moral worth has nothing to do with values in the ordinary sense. And that led ultimately to Max Weber's concept of a value-free social science. Yes.
And what conditions, in your view, if satisfied, would be both necessary and sufficient to make a case for correlation, a causal correlation between an idea and some historical happenstance? Like, I'm particularly interested in, let's say, whenever a correlation is made between a particular set of ideas or idea and of a philosophical nature, or even of a economical nature, and some political circumstance, let's say, like the rise of the Nazis, a rise of fascism, a rise of totalitarianism. And then the appendage question is, do you think that Peacock satisfies those conditions in experiments?
Yeah. Well, I think that Kant is one of the several causal connections, one of the several causes of the cultural chaos of the 20th century, including Hitler.
Would you say?
But I don't think that Kant unleashed Hitler in the. I mean, there was considerable distortion, any more than you can say. I'm not making any value judgments now about the person involved, but Ayn Rand unleashed Murray Rothbard, or something like that. I think Hitler came from a tradition of, if he came from any tradition at all, it was a tradition of voluntarism and activism, which was generically what Kant was doing when he talked about the primacy of the practical, but he immediately introduced this notion of the lawfulness of the practical, which Hitler could never follow.
Right, but is it sufficient, let's say, if I wanted to make a case saying that Kant or Hegel or Plato influenced the Nazis, influenced the Nazi thinkers, and not only the philosophical thinkers,
Yes.
there weren't, but
Oh, yeah.
yeah, I know there were, but you know, the political thinkers of the movement. Is it sufficient just to say, well, look, here's a correlation between what Kant said and what some Nazi thinkers are saying? They both are espousing the primacy of the practical. Or is it also necessary to show that the thinkers themselves, the latter thinkers, the political thinkers, in the historical sense, actually thought of these prior thinkers as influencing them, or actually said something like, well, you know, yeah, Hegel was a big influence on us, because there's been a lot of talk about how, in fact, a lot of Nazi thinkers criticized Kant, criticized Hegel,
Yeah.
and yet for some people that wouldn't really mean very much. They could say, well, Kant or Hegel played a causal role in the intellectual formation of such a movement, whether the Nazis themselves recognized it or not.
Well, I think to make a major causal correlation between someone like Kant and someone like Hitler, you would have to say that Hitler adopted the idea in the sense in which Kant meant it, and then acted upon the idea. Because if Kant came forth with an idea and immediately said, this corollary must go along with this idea, then you have to take him seriously as meaning that. I mean, it's as if you took seriously Newton's concept of gravitation without taking seriously his concept of inertia. I mean, you wouldn't have any solar system in that case. And in that sense, Kant did not bring forth Hitler. But in the sense that he generated a whole climate of opinion which led to the denial of one of his concepts and the affirmation of another of his concepts, he stands in a causal chain.
Would you say that Hitler would not have been possible if not Kant, if were it not for Kant? I mean, is he a necessary part of the causal chain?
So was Hitler's mother.
I don't see why it's important. You know, just place blame or I mean, the ideas are the same. I don't see why it really matters that much if you got them from Kant or something.
Well, but the issue at stake is the role of ideas in history.
Plato was necessary in order that we might have Aristotle. That's probably true.
And Hume was necessary in order that we had Kant.
Yes. Moses was necessary in order that we have Jesus. So forth and so on. Hegel was necessary in order that we had Marx.
But if it hadn't been for Kant, would the atmosphere that allowed Hitler to do what he did have been present?
I think that the primacy of pure action would have arisen as a doctrine, and the Romanticists would have had more power. In a certain way, they would have gained a lot more unthinking disciples, but they would not have had the intellectual prestige, on the other hand.
So in a sense, he slowed them down, but he also gave them prestige.
Yeah. Like a person pressing on the accelerator and the brake at once. Now, Murray?
Are there any classical liberals, outside of objectivists, who argue with the Austrians and who had argued with William and Sumner about the efficacy of Kantian thought? I mean, I'm thinking of this fellow Corwin, and I'm thinking of another fellow named Gustav who wrote a book which was mistranslated. The title is not called Freedom and Domination, which basically I had sold a while ago. And he makes the same point that Kant and Luther caused the Nazis.
Yeah, I think I read that book.
I say to the Austrians who are not objectivists, but who agree with classical liberal views, you're making a mistake.
Well, does someone here know in detail what Rothbard's theory of rights is? I think that he would have he would defend rights in some sense other than those of a Kantian.
There's a Catholic Thomistic tradition of rights,
Oh, yeah.
which is very Aristotelian and
Oh, yeah.
has none of the modern Kantian formalistic Kantian theory of rights. The rights are based squarely on the idea of man, of certain ends or goals or values that are essential to human life. And so in that it's the values are a little different from objectivism.
And that issues in some sort of defense of capitalism.
But right, yes, one
The Salamanca
there are
school.
thinkers of this school, and I think Rothbard would claim to be one.
Yeah.
But isn't his a self-ownership theory? Doesn't everything proceed from the
Yeah.
axiom of self-ownership?
Yeah, the logic of the actual derivation of rights differs from one theorist to another. But
Is
broadly
that
speaking, you can say that these are substantive theories rather than formal theories of Kant's. So they're based on some positing some basic reality we pursue, and then rights are necessary conditions for achieving it.
Who are some of those thinkers?
Well,
Novak?
Suarez?
Michael Novak is, he's not really a
Yeah.
classical liberal.
More
Not
about,
like a conservative modern liberal.
I know.
But yes, there's a whole school at the end of the Middle Ages, the Salamanca school. George, you know the names.
Suarez, Molina are two major names. Vasquez is another.
And all the pre-Kantian natural rights theorists, really, Locke. All of
Oh,
these
yeah.
people were non-Kantian.
Hooker,
But they,
the judicious Hooker.
their scholarship now, where they argue with the classical, their disciples argue with the Austrian classical liberals, much the way objectivists would argue with the Austrian classical liberals. Or is it just, they're just not talking to each other?
There's no real school.
Yeah.
Well, there's so-called fusionist school. Frank Rhino was officially classical liberal, but also Catholic.
Oh, yeah. In the National Review.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's one man.
Frank Meyer. This gentleman.
I'm afraid I still don't understand the relationship in the categorical imperative between universalizability and I don't understand whether the relationship is one of practice or desirability. When you universalize that maxim, is the outcome acceptable because it's a good outcome?
Oh,
Or
no.
is it empirically possible? And I universalize it and it results in some sort of texture of contradictions in reality. What are the conditions for acceptability? I don't understand.
That it passes that negative test. That if it were universalized, that it would be possible to practice, and that you could will it as a universal law.
Mm-hmm. And people can still do it. People can still.
That's right.
It's just a practical possibility. That's the test.
Yes. That's part of the meaning of it. There's also the question of take humanity as an end,
Humanity. Well,
either in yourself or in another. The
you would
formula
treat,
goes.
whole?
He doesn't say as a whole, but the point we've been arguing about the noumenal self, whether it is really an individual or whether they're all noumenal selves are the same, would seem to bear in the direction of the whole. So that ultimately you could say that Kant was a kind of founder of metaphysical collectivism by his concept of humanity as the noumenal self. Because what noumenal self do I take as my end when I take your noumenal self as an end? It's a noumenal self that is no different, as far as its characteristics are concerned, from my own. Ellen?
I'm interested in the impact of Kant on the philosophy of science, the whole analytic synthetic thing, and how quickly was that adopted by scientists at the time?
I don't think the analytic synthetic distinction was ever. You don't mean the synthetic a priori, you mean the synthetic analytic distinction.
Well, yeah.
Per se. In time, that became adopted by the positivists, yes. And that was one of Kant's main influences on the logical positivists. Another main influence on the logical positivists was the principle of verification.
That's from Kant.
Yes. That is to say that when I say that there is a glass of water here, I mean that if I put my hand out and bring it to my lips, certain consequences, certain empirical consequences would follow. You heard the limerick, Johnny was a chemist's son, Johnny is no more, for what he thought was H2O was H2SO4. It may be too late by the time you... It may be too late before the sense data appear, but it must lead to empirical consequences if it is to be actual, Kant says. And that principle of verification he did bequeath to the positivists. And they quote him on that.
Yeah.
The second analogy of the critique of pure reason. Yes. Are you finished?
Well, I was just wondering about the whole issue that only things that are testable are...
Operationalism,
yeah.
Yes. That certainly derives from Kant. Now, whether it would have happened anyway without him is another question. Did you want to ask a question?
Yes.
Yep.
Ready?
Right.
It's actually related areas. Back from lecture 2, Kant's view was that mathematics is synthetic. And yet, from what I understand of most of the history since then, most everyone else thinks that mathematics is analytic. And that's also the view taken in Peikoff's essay on the analytic synthetic dichotomy, where it says the dominant view today is that mathematics is analytic. So what happened along there? Is that true, what I just said? That distinction?
Is the analytic synthetic distinction itself valid, or?
No. Kant took the view that that mathematics is synthetic.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
But from what I read in other sources, including Peikoff's article about the analytic synthetic dichotomy, he says that, and other people say that mathematics is analytic. So is that whole tradition of the analytic distinction in distinction from the Kant's view that mathematics is synthetic?
Is the whole tradition of the analytic synthetic distinction in...
Why were most thinkers not convinced by Kant that mathematics was synthetic rather than analytic?
And apparently still today, the dominant view is that mathematics is analytic, as opposed to what Kant said.
I think that they don't accept the idea that mathematics has a sensuous condition depending upon an a priori form of time. And that's probably why most of them. David?
Well, one factor in the case of geometry was that the development of non-Euclidean geometries.
Oh, yes.
Where
Yeah.
it became, that convinced a lot of people that geometry, that there's nothing special about Euclidean geometry. Because that was a strong point.
Yes, of course, of course.
Theory, it seems to describe the world.
Of course.
We can be absolutely certain about it in advance of any experiment.
And then when Einstein applied it to the physical universe, it became even more.
Right. There was no, so there had been heretofore a preconceived notion that there had to be some kind of correlation between, let's say, geometry and the world out there. And now it was shown that Euclidean geometry could be correlated to our universe, but so could non-Euclidean geometry. So there was sort of no necessary connection between the two. And also, just the very fact of the formation of a non-Euclidean geometry. Prior to that, they just didn't think that there could have been an alternative to Euclidean. So
Kant was aware of the fact that there could be
there could be
yeah.
An alternative to Euclidean.
Yes. He uses the term non-Euclidean geometry, if developed, would be one of the greatest achievements of the human race. But he doesn't think it would be applicable to the actual world. I'd like to raise a question to David. I'm wondering if there's some parallel between his theory of perception, or the objectivist theory of perception, and Kant's idea that apparently he held the idea that if we perceive things, we must perceive them in some form, and therefore, in some sense, the form is a priori, and whether your theory is not, therefore, in spite of itself, a form of Kantianism. I've heard students have raised this point with me.
I know. Well,
probably with you too.
People publish things saying that, but the objectivist theory and agrees with Kant that any form of any mode of cognition involves the exercise of a certain capacity, a faculty of cognition, which has its own nature, and that the exercise of that nature has effects on the nature of the cognitive state that derives from it, whether it's perception or concepts, or scientific theorizing, or whatever. In the case of perception, we're dealing with sensory apparatus. Physiological mechanisms that give rise to forms in which things appear to us. Just perspectival shifts. And certain whole attributes like colors turn out to be a product of the way our senses react to the things. But the difference between the objectivist theory and Kant's is in the interpretation of that fact. Kant took it as a consequence of that I'm speaking now at the most general level, that just about the mere fact, before we even look at what the specific forms of perception are, just the fact that perception has to be in a form. Kant took that as meaning that we don't know things as they are themselves, that we're not aware of them, even if he held as one interpretation that says, and maybe it's the one that you would lean toward, George, even if he's saying that we perceive the things in themselves, we just don't grasp their nature. We don't grasp what they are in themselves. Well, okay, there's still a vast difference with objectivism, because the objectivist theory is that in perceiving them in a form, we are perceived. That's what it is to perceive them as they are. That in perceiving the soda can in front of me as red, I'm actually seeing the intrinsic attributes of the thing, but I'm seeing it in the form. And it's only later that I can conceptually distinguish the two. But
and what is the intrinsic attribute of the thing?
The reflectance properties, in virtue of which it reflects the wavelengths of light that it does.
Oh, but phenomenologically, I take red to be the intrinsic attribute of that can, and then I would be incorrect in doing so, right? Because according to your theory, colors, among other called the secondary qualities, would fall under the ontological category of relation. Not,
That's right. You perceive,
Yeah.
you do not perceive that as not as a relational property, the redness of it. And yet it is a relational property. But all that shows is that your senses are not omniscient. Your senses are quite accurate in that the redness doesn't depend on any perceivable thing. You don't perceive your own sense apparatus. But, so the senses are not deceiving you in any way. They're just not giving you the whole story. But I mean, what can you expect? Rome wasn't built in a day.
right, certainly, but can that still lead us to the distinction of how things, how things really are, as opposed to how we see them or how we perceive them.
Right.
We'll come to discover, as you came to discover in that chapter where you deal with colors, through the review of the psychological and physiological literature, that colors are not in fact intrinsic to objects, that they're relations, they're related. So here, up to now, we have naively thought, all of us as naive realists, well, yeah, it's that can that's really colored. It's that can. It's not like some relation here. And then you, through your review of psychological literature, tell us, well, no, it's not intrinsic to the can. It's a relation that's sort of caused by both the perceiver, the perceptual systems, and the environment, the sun, reflecting properties of the object. So doesn't that still lead us to draw conclusions that there is a significant difference between the world as it really is and the world as we perceive it, and that we really can't know the difference until even when we get into a third-person perspective and examine a person's first-person interaction with another object, we're still from that first person. We're observing that interaction from a first-person perspective.
If you observe this whole situation without presupposition, I think you would say that discovering that the color, which you see there, depends on something you didn't realize it depends on in your own visual apparatus, is just like discovering that water, the boiling of water depends not just on the fire, which is pretty obvious, but on the atmospheric pressure. When you discover that, and you discover that water boils at a lower temperature, when you take the elevator, you don't say, my God, the world was deceiving me all this time because it didn't reveal this fact since I'd always been at sea level. And maybe boiling isn't real, or maybe fire isn't. No, you just say, there's a causal factor here that I didn't know about before, now I know that. That's one of the causal factors at work. Doesn't mean the other factors aren't at work. There's still a can. It's the way it does because of the way it is. What makes us, what gives rise to that notion that the senses are deceiving us is an antecedent assumption about what honesty would consist in here. And it's that antecedent notion is what I call this diaphanous model.
Honesty?
What it would mean to be non-deceptive or honest. I mean, when you say that something is deceptive, you have a standard of honesty in mind. Mm-hmm. And even though this is an analogy here or a metaphorical use of the term in regarding the senses, the point still holds. To say that the senses are deceiving me, you have to have some notion of what it would mean for them not to deceive me. Mm-hmm. And I think implicit in that that line of thought is this diaphanous model that real perception of the way the world really is would be it wouldn't appear at all. There would be no such thing as appearance. It would just be the thing, and then it's open window. This ray of insight, which doesn't depend on any causal interaction between me and things.
Isn't that?
And is therefore something magical.
There's no particularity, there's no physical instrumentality, there's no nothing. So it ends up utterly indescribable.
Right, which is, right. And that's magic. So
what Ayn Rand called perception know-how.
Right, but isn't that nonetheless desirable? Because you could still come up with some argument. Well, since even when we're in the third person perspective, observing somebody else's interaction with the world, as a psychologist or physiologist would, we're still tied behind our methods of perceiving things. So we can describe the conditions that we see that lead this first person, perspective, perceiver, to react to the object. But we ourselves are perceiving that entire interaction from within our sensual apparatus and from within our conceptual apparatus. So it seems as if just we could never really get outside of our apparatus of perceiving and conceiving about things.
Right.
And so we really can't ever get a picture unless we would take, as has been taken as a model before, this is God's eye view, I think, the ultimate third person. And then look at how things would be completely independent of any perceptual apparatus, any conceptual apparatus.
But listen to what you're asking for. You're asking for a picture of things without any mechanism for taking the picture. A view of things that's not from anything.
Exactly. In order to know the difference between what I bring to the picture and what the picture has in and of
How does that
itself.
differ from asking, lamenting the fact that we can't have a dance without an answer? When you're asking for something that's physically impossible. Okay, to have a view, you've got to have a viewer. And the viewer has to have some nature.
Certainly, certainly. And I'm willing to admit it, but then I would just say, well, then you can't have it both ways. You can't say that we can actually come to an objective distinction between perceiver and perceived, world as it is in and of itself, and still have the points that are obvious to all of us, that is, that our perceptual apparatus and our conceptual apparatus play a role in how we perceive the world.
Couldn't it be that Kant was concerned with a somewhat different point? Kant was perfectly aware of the fact that our eyes impose certain forms, color and so forth and so on things, and our ears and our nose and so forth and so on. He never mentions, to my knowledge, the relativity of perception as an argument for his point of view. He's entirely concerned with space and time. He's not concerned with color. He's not concerned with smell or anything like that. He doesn't use any of these things as an argument for his position. But what the difference with space and time is that what he finds in the case of these two forms of perception is that each of them has a corresponding science. Space has the form of, or rather, geometry has the form of space, and arithmetic the form of time. And because of the fact that these are a priori, he assumes that they're imposed by the mind. He never deals with what you might call the forms imposed by the sense organs, which might be discovered a posteriori.
Well, these, when Kant talks about space and time and assumes that these are forms of perception, I mean, here's a substantive difference, because I see no reason to hold that either space or time is anything but intrinsic in the world. The way we perceive them is dependent on our sense apparatus, and there are spatial forms, perspectival shifts and so forth, and temporal illusions and so forth that we're subject to. But space and time per se, I don't see any reason to hold that they're out, that they're not out there. In that respect, they're a little different from colors. So I just make that point because this is one case where there's not a match between the objectivist concept of form and the concept. But
Kant would regard the space and time as much more serious than color and so forth, but you would regard the color and things like that as much more serious than the space and time. That is to say, well, I mean a more serious problem or puzzle, a pseudo-puzzle if you want to call it that. You don't discuss the possibility that space and time might themselves be forms imposed by either the perceptual organs or the mind. You never mention that, and Kant never mentions the colors.
But I always took that as due to the fact that these things were, by the time Kant was writing, color, the relativity of colors was well established. I mean, no one was denying that anymore.
And he didn't use this as an argument to say that the mind imposes.
But he certainly held that color was part of was relative to us. It's part of the material of sensation.
Yes,
material
but he didn't
science.
regard it as essential to his transcendental philosophy, that color was relative to us.
Okay, well, let me just... As you represented Kant as he represents himself, as arguing that we have to hold that space and time are forms imposed by the mind because they are they underlie the sciences of geometry and arithmetic effectively, and those are synthetic a priori. There's no other explanation of how we can have synthetic a priori knowledge in those fields. That always struck me as kind of a tail wagging this enormous dog. I mean, to start with the assumption that two specific areas of knowledge have this epistemological status, the synthetic a priori. To make that your assumption, your unquestioned assumption, and then to reason from that to conclusions that imply that there is this gulf between man's mind and reality altogether, and that in radical, unprecedented ways, theoretically, the mind is out of touch with the way things are. I never believed, I guess, that was Kant's real reason for holding that position. It was a convenient way of expanding it, maybe, but
if you,
I could be wrong.
If you look in the preface to the first edition, A17, you'll see that he specifically says that he's not, that his argument is from he specifically identifies his important argument as the argument from the a priority of geometry and arithmetic and the a priority of the categories. He also holds the position that the characteristics of the perceiving and conceiving organs introduce something new that wasn't there before, but he says that my basic position is the first position, and it would stand even if the second were wrong. So you've got to give him the benefit of taking seriously what he says is his main position, don't you?
Well, right, you do. You have to take at his word unless you have reason to think otherwise. But if that were the case, I guess these does seem to be pretty inconsequential arguments because there's no reason to accept his premises.
Yeah.
Whereas in the case of, if you look at it, the argument is posed by the fact that we are subject to illusions. There are perceptual phenomena of appearances. I mean, those are strong arguments that really have to be answered because those are real phenomena. But, so,
Isn't that kind of constitute a gigantic sort of stolen concept? Start with the truth of two branches of science having certain characteristics and reason from that to an unbridgeable gulf between man's mind and reality. That seems to be a problem.
it's always been my
Just a gigantic stolen concept.
Isn't the
Or if
objective?
you will, a stolen tail.
Right.
Dog, the dog, what the way a tail wagging.
Isn't the objectivist position essentially that the senses are physical organs interacting with the physical world by physical causal laws, where Kant denies the causation between our perceptions and the noumenal world? That there's no direct physical causation.
That is a
categories,
difference. That
so-
certainly is a difference, and it's a major difference.
I think the objectivist position is not that whether I perceive that red correctly, because that could be colorblind. And objectivism says my senses are still valid. I just have a sensual disadvantage, but the crucial thing here, the connection with Kant might be whether sensual deficiency affects your mental capacity, whether that makes it impossible for you to deal with reality. And I think that's why Ayn Rand used Helen Keller as an example. Remember? Helen Keller as an example.
Oh, yeah.
She couldn't hear, she couldn't see, she was taught. And how she learned her first concept, just all she had was sensation. But in other words, her mind wasn't invalidated. It took her much longer than it would take us.
Right.
But, she had tremendous sensual disadvantage.
But why would Kant then necessarily say that the lack of a specific sense for more than one would be deprivation to the mind? When he never depends
I know
on
that
the
he does. That's the question I would pose. If he doesn't, then I would say that there's a link between that and objectivism.
I could not myself see the relevance of the Helen Keller argument to the validity or invalidity of Kant's position.
Well, I mean, in that Kant versus Sullivan article?
Yeah.
Well, it was not Kant directly, it was that fellow who was at
Feyerabend.
Feyerabend, yes, who was saying that sensory evidence is dispensable.
Right, but she called the thing Kant versus Sullivan rather than Feyerabend versus Sullivan. So I meant in that sense, she mentioned.
I need to change side of the tape before we go far.
The perception, as David and Francisco and I seem to be, or not. Maybe this is not of general interest.
I think it's very interesting.
How could one not be?
How could one not be?
You said something to Francisco, you gave him an answer that I think leads into the unsatisfied what you said after. You said, we see the red as intrinsic to the can. And that suggests that we've got an error. It's not. And that therefore, in the perception is an error that has to be overcome. And if our senses are giving us errors, and all we've got is our senses, how do you, that doesn't comport with your boiling water example, where you know something, there are no errors. If we see it as red, intrinsic.
But we're talking now, remember, we're talking here about, when we talk about perceiving that as red or as, the red as intrinsic, we're talking about judgments that we make on the basis of sensory evidence.
It's an error of perception.
Right, perception itself is just something that happens. There's no true or false about it. It's just a contact between us and it takes a certain form. So the question is now, what exactly are we judging? And are we in some way being led inexorably to make a false judgment? And I would say no. We're judging, you have to take the judgment as implying a certain context. The context is in relation, in regard to everything that I can observe perceptually, the color is a non-relational property. It does not depend relationally on anything else that I can observe in the situation. It's just there in the can. That's true. Because the things that in fact it depends on are not things that are perceptually present in the situation. They're observable only at a much more advanced, sophisticated level of knowledge. It's like a simpler example of the same thing would be, I said the color is continuous.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Well, it is continuous perceptually, even though if I took out a microscope and looked, I assume this would work with a canvas that does with human blood. At a certain level of brain, you don't see red anymore, you see flecks of brown or whatever it might be. And it reveals itself at that level as non-continuous. But that doesn't mean that I was wrong in saying it's continuous, because that statement was contextual. It means at this level of observation, given everything that I can see here now, it is continuous. So you just have to interpret it contextually that way. So I don't think that the judgment, if the judgment is made rationally and made in light of the context. Now, if you expect your senses to reveal every fact of that's about the can in some omniscient way, and you base your judgment on that, and you say, I'm judging now that this is an intrinsic property, and that I will never, under any circumstances, have reason to qualify that. Well, then, yeah, that would be. Then the problem is you making the judgment on
And you can also see rather early, thousands of years ago, it didn't have to be in our scientific age, that the can didn't intrinsically have redness to it, because even someone in a cave, if you had a can of Coca-Cola, when the sun went down, it would start to get gray. It would look different. And so he could ask the question, instead of saying, well, am I being deceived by my senses? He could just say, well, oh, here's an interesting fact, that under another condition, there's a different relationship going on.
Yeah, true. Although you probably would have said, well, just enough light. There has to be a certain amount of light for color to be visible. Just as there has to be a certain amount of light for anything.
Yeah, but that is one.
But what it is that's visible is really out there. That would be an point. But yeah, at the common sense level, it's been available to mankind forever. There are many observations that will lead us to be aware of the difference between appearances.
What about the case of Berkeley and the 3 tubs of water, where you You have a tub of very hot water, a tub of very cold water, and a tub of lukewarm water, and you put one hand in the hot water tub, the hot tub, and the other in the cold tub, and then take them out and plunge them into the middle tub. It's not a case of relativity here between two observers or even two times. It's
Two different sets of data. Two different sets of data.
so all my data are in my hands.
Well, your hands are your sense organs here, so you have two sense organs at work which are in different conditions of that prior adaptation, and they will respond differently to the same external situation.
The person in the naive realist position would think that the quality of hotness or coldness was in the water, and he would find a contradiction here, and that he was being fed two contradictory items of information at the same time.
Right.
So he would say, if I perceive something as hot, then something here must be hot.
That is the formal statement of the diaphanous model.
Yeah.
If something appears F, where F is any attribute, then something must be F.
Yeah.
Because that's essentially denying the whole concept of appearance. That is, that there's a relationship between the object and the receiver. And replacing that idea with the notion of simply a revelation of the thing is what it is, and that's it. There's nothing else has to happen, or nothing else is involved in awareness. There's just the thing and the ray, or whatever, that connects.
And then there's a corollary that sort of comes with the disillusionment that a naive realist eventually comes to, and that is, well, if something appears F, and it in fact is not F, then we're not really perceiving F.
Right. And many people say, well, then there must be something else that's F, some inner object. And that's where you start to get a representationalist picture or inner phenomenon. Or
some state I'm out here, so you can't see it, but it's out there.
right, but that reaction to no one's a naive realist. No philosophers. They all recognize in one way, at least in perception, that the world is not revealed diaphanously in that way. But the role of the model is in setting that as an expectation for what it would mean to perceive the world. Some people react by saying, well, therefore we don't. And in that respect, Kant was, in my view, Kant was the conservation of a long tradition in philosophy. I think he was reacting in this way on a much more fundamental level.
Isn't part of that also this idea of the positivist, that everything knowable about an object must be present in the direct perception of it, and otherwise your senses are lying to you. You can't see everything that's there, including the structure of the surface of that which reflects or refracts or whatever. You're not seeing the real object in some sense. You're not getting all the information. You're being deceived.
I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Well, the positivist idea that all knowledge begins and ends with sense perception, period. That any additional thought and exploration shouldn't be necessary. That you should be able to see directly that red is a relationship and not intrinsic to the can. And if you can't see that directly, then your senses are deceiving you.
Well, I don't know any positive thinkers who would have said exactly that. They did say something maybe similar, that we start with sensations. But the test of what's directly given as a foundation for knowledge is, what's immediately available in a single glance, which would be only what we would call sensation. But then they thought you could build structures of knowledge on top of that. It did require effort, through logical means. Or not.
I just wanted to ask, what was the exact prevailing definition of reason before Kant came along? And what,
Well,
how do you differentiate between reason and pure reason?
Those are two different.
That's two questions.
I think it was assumed that reason is essentially the perception of reality in the broad sense of perception, not in the sensual sense of perception only. Reason is the awareness of reality as perceived and as conceptualized. I think that was generally accepted. Now, the difference between, wouldn't you say, David? That was pretty generally accepted. No matter whether you were, now by pure reason, he meant reason which has no empirical element in it. That is, he meant that part of awareness which is contributed by the mind and the mind alone, rather rather than by any admixture with empirical perception or empirical cases or empirical items or empirical evidence. There's a pure theoretical reason and a pure practical reason. The pure theoretical reason is exercised through the understanding in the case of ordinary empirical objects. The pure practical reason is exercised through the categorical imperative.
Let's say like that figure you mentioned of 1,000 sides that you could construct in your
Kiliagan.
that been a product of pure reason?
That would have been a product of the understanding.
Because you'd have to know what a line is before you have to perceive it at some point where you can design that.
Oh yes, the definition of a Kiliagan would have an empirical element in it.
So it would not be.
It would have a constructive element. The definition of the Kiliagan would have a constructive element in this sense that I could tell you what you had to do in order to verify that this was a Kiliagan. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You see, keep going and add another and another and another and another until you get to 1,000. So the concept of the Kiliagan is a concept of a procedure. Now this was Kant's contribution to operationalism, as a matter of fact. Yes.
Is this a pattern? I mean, I was just struck by the way what you said about reason as a pattern. I never thought of this before, but that is how Kant looks at it, and it does seem different. Although I can't think of any particular definitions of reason prior to Kant. But I mean, prior to Kant, people seem to be thought more in terms of essentials. The reason is a faculty of knowledge, and therefore it's dealing with reality, differentiated from other faculties, maybe by the use of principles. But for Kant, I mean, Kant came along and said, well, we'll dispense with the purpose of it, and we'll just talk about the differentiated by the form. He uses principles. He did the same thing with objectivity. We'll dispense with the world. It's just a fact. But when something's objective, people agree with it universally.
Yeah, I think that he sort of rejected the concept of a faculty as the origin of his account of reason.
Well, there's a whole style of thinking in philosophy since then that drives people with an objectivist background crazy, because it's like people stumbling around to define something. It's like they're carefully stumbling around the obvious. like the operation was wondering, um, giving an operational definition of truth. That a statement is true if it can be linked back to, there's a specific sequence of operations that would lead to a verification. Why don't you say it's true if it corresponds to the world? Is Kant the source of?
Because you find out whether it corresponds to the world by a series of operations.
Okay,
Yes,
fine.
and now we have
Sure.
reason.
Fine, yeah, that's true. But you perform those operations rather than the operations, say, of mixing together 3 parts of ground lizard kidneys or something with some wolfbane and guessing at the result. You perform one specific set of operations rather than another because you think that will lead to tell you whether it corresponds. So in terms of a definition, you would keep being led back to the notion of correspondence.
Well, Kant never abandoned the correspondence theory of truth, to my knowledge.
Well, maybe that's a bad example. And I'm just wondering if Kant is the source of this kind of
Maybe.
style.
But he introduced a certain sense, I think, good sense when he led people to define the property of harder as body A is harder than body B if A will scratch B. Now that's a very simple operation. There's nothing wrong with it, I would say.
Not as a test or criterion, but it's still the concept of hardness is still a concept of an attribute in virtue of which the one thing can scratch the other.
Yes,
Gives it the power to.
I would say so, yes. But I think he was right in stressing the necessity of operations in order to establish objective attributes.
David, I don't know, when you were mentioning that why modern philosophers always seem to carefully stumble around the obvious, if you think about it, acts of cognition on all levels, almost all of the ways we understand them in metaphors come from perception. It's clear, it's clearly that's true. I can see it, isn't it obvious? I mean, look at it, isn't that right? But if the act of cognition, perceiving from which all those derive, is established as invalid, unconnected with the world, somehow fraudulent, then it all collapses. Then all the other acts of cognition must somehow be, if they're direct, straightforward, clear, see it, penetrate to it. If that's a deception on that basic level, then you have to complicate it all on a higher level, because if it were that straightforward, it also would be.
But another example of what you're talking about probably is categorical imperative. The good is that which is universalizable. Well, that's part of it. I mean, that's characteristic.
Yeah.
You think
Right, that isn't a good example, yeah.
of some inessential element, and makes that the essence.
Yeah.
And that's why it seems so plausible. That's why, but it leads to problems because it's not the essence.
Right. Yeah, that is a good example. Like the categorical imperative. The mere fact that you can universalize an action, well, you have to bring it under some principle to show that it's a good action. But the fact that it's under some principle doesn't get you in part of it. I mean, like, take the example. What's the example you used about killing your little sister and eating her?
Chopping her, putting her in soup.
I mean, you said the maximum of this action is nutrition. Satisfying hunger. Well, then, that is what you're doing. That would be valid. There's nothing wrong with that principle.
Neither would Kant. Kant would not say there was anything wrong with
You're
it.
saying that's a valid maxim, according to under Kant's.
Eating food when you're hungry, sure.
No,
Cut up your little
sister.
sister.
So by chopping off your daughter or what have you.
It depends how you define the maximum.
Well,
No,
that's
not even, I can't even imagine a contextual manner.
No, you don't even mention that it's a little sister.
no, the point is
But that's not.
that you can universalize. The point is you can always find some aspect of the action that's universalized. universaalizable. So if that's all
Would you be willing that your little sister cut you up and put you in the soup?
No, but I'd be willing that my little sister would eat food.
But now you're back to being willing, and that's the question I was asking for. I thought it wasn't a question of whether you were willing to admit it, it was a
Oh, no.
question of whether it was possible.
He uses the word will. You presumably, if something was impossible, you wouldn't will it. You don't will to make square circles in your basement tonight, right?
You know,
I wouldn't, but I know people that
Yes, but what it would.
It's easier to show logically that take any action, you can always find some maxim, some aspect of it that can be universalized, and some aspect of it that can't be universalized. Like, I'm breathing right now. And presumably Kant would say that's universalizable action. But it's not because my breathing is simultaneously the act of taking in certain specific molecules and extracting the oxygen. And if I'm doing it, none of the rest of you can have those molecules. I've got them. So under that description, this act can be universalized. I mean, this is silly, but it just shows you how empty the notion of universality is. Universalization.
Yeah. No, I thought the reason that what made it so plausible is in fact that once you run things through that criteria of universalizability, and in fact you exclude a lot of things which even objectivists would exclude, and you include a lot of things which objectivists would exclude. And that's what I thought you meant when you were saying that it's a semi-plausible theory. But then you come up with examples like, well, how about the maxim of eating up your daughter and you're putting it in the soup and having a seasoning, Now that doesn't seem to me to make the theory at all plausible. In fact, it makes it sound very ridiculous. And if it's at all plausible or semi-plausible, as you're saying it is, then maxims like that just would be ruled out of court.
No, that's not.
Why? Why would they be ruled out of court?
There's no claim that maxim is plausible. The point was that the idea of acting in accordance with principle, that's a very plausible theory. I mean, it's right.
It sure is. And just simply on the basis of that, without any reference whatsoever to human nature and human needs, you can get a lot of satisfactory results, I would think, would say. Maybe not as satisfactory results as you would want as an objectivist, with also included a reference to human nature, human needs. But you could get a lot of satisfactory results and exclude a lot of dissatisfactory results, such as cannibalism.
I still think that every truth has to have a context, and the universalizable thing seems to be to say we can not have to worry about it anymore.
But what do you do? You're supposed to, my understanding is you're supposed to sit there, wrestle with the categorical imperative, which is essentially contentless, but it is the container in which you measure every maxim. And you ask yourself, can I visualize this being put into practice? Now, if you're trying to visualize it, you are trying to put it into some kind of context, some phenomenal context, which he does not outlaw.
Well, what do you do about alternatives that are both universalizable?
Like what?
Altruism and egoism. You can imagine both of them, either of them, as being universalizable. So how do you choose between them?
Oh, what kind of egoism?
Randian egoism.
Yeah, and what kind of altruism? I mean, I think Rand
God,
yes.
yes.
There are certain forms of altruism which can be universalized.
Well, they can. They just have bad consequences.
Well, yeah, they have bad consequences, right? And they lead to sort of frustration of what you actually want to achieve by the action. Supposedly, a lot of altruists want to achieve benevolence and generosity and what have you in the world. That sort of sensitivity towards humankind and towards one another, a sense of brotherhood. But if you interpret altruism to mean what I think
no one
has been
says
interpreted by Rand to mean, then I mean you eventually lead to wholesale sacrifice of other people, including sacrifice of their lives.
Yeah, but when you just examine the categorical imperative, Kant doesn't say, by the way, you also have to be benevolent and you have to take these other principles into account. So that if somebody were a sadist and said, well, yeah, I like this idea of, one noose for one neck.
Right. but he's restricted still by the criterion of universalizability. His action of hanging people up, or hanging, a great many people up with one big noose, it's just not universalizable.
Well, he would say he's willing to take the risk of somebody doing it to him in exchange for the pleasure of doing it to others.
Well, what
How do
he
we know
wants
what's
or cares, that's irrelevant. What?
I mean, you said, he's just saying, how do we know, I mean, we're putting, this is the second time I end up defending Kant, this is outrageous, but we're putting words in his mouth like wholesale now. It seems to me that he is responsible for a whole lot of things. To the extent that he posited this unknowable, the objective's formulation of what's going on with the red can is fundamentally different from anything Kant would say, because when you start asking where is the red, you come up with a different answer. And his basically is it's unknowable. Once you say unknowable, for whatever reasons you said it, you have left the door open to anything that walks through. And to that degree, it seems to me that he is responsible in a lot of ways for a lot of people and that came afterwards, and a lot of things that they said and did. But I cannot imagine that when he posits the categorical imperative, it's meant to be totally without any regard to context. It's like what Walsh said. It's not just, it's meant to apply. You're supposed to sit there in the phenomenal world and do the best you can with it. And just mull it over and say, can I universalize this maxim? And when you're asking yourself that, yes, you have to measure it against a lot of other things that you're thinking about. And things will make sense or not make sense to you as at that moment in the phenomenal world. Then you take your action.
Right, but I mean, the theory of the categorical imperative as a whole is, I think, context sensitive. Do you think? I mean, I thought that when we were actually the lecture where we discussed this ethic, somebody brought up an maxim and then said, well, how about if we water it down, and put it in a different context? I mean, I think those are things that one can do within the theory. They don't, in the theory, you don't have to sort of accept just one maxim. I think the example was raised about murder, and whether or not murder is always wrong, or whether you could kill somebody in self-defense. And I think Kant would say that you could actually formulate a maxim that is universalizable, where murder is in all instances immoral except when it's in self-defense. And that maxim, qualified contextually as it is universalizable.
Yes, but a maxim is not per se a moral principle. No. The maxim is just a policy. And if you can universalize that policy, then following the maxim is permissible. So that the categorical imperative is a negative filter through which all maxims must flow.
Yeah. Rawls is a good example of an alternative that can both be universalized. Rawls' approach to minimax versus, the idea that you can maximize gain rather than minimize loss. They're both universalizable.
Yeah, Rawls is in some ways it's a clear example of the same line of thought. Because the way he puts it is instead of universalize your maxim, he said find a principle on which everyone can agree. All right, so we'll imagine everyone agreeing on it, and that's the universe. That's where the element. And I mean, and that does make sense. If you have some, if you can find some reason in his denuded selves to explain why he gave originally thinking that people would read one thing rather than another. But
isn't Rand getting to that on her own terms when she talks about, when she asserts that rational men do not have actual conflicts? I mean, world of rationally acting individuals, there would be no conflict of interest. She's asserting that, in essence, that the objectivist ethics is universalizable. It's a world that would work without irreconcilable conflicts. And so, wouldn't the objectivist ethics fit within that criterion of universalizability?
I should think so. It's a necessary but not sufficient.
Well, right. The only way you can begin to show that interests do not conflict is by showing what people people's true interests are. And to do that, you have to show, you have to talk about what values people should be pursuing. You can't, and so you can't leave the realm of values and treat them as all subjective.
Because if you recall, I mean, in the article, she discounts a certain view, let's say, of interest. Let's say both of us want a job or what have you. But that's sufficient to say that that's an interest that would conflict here. You know, we're both trying to get into a theater. There's only one ticket left.
Right, and Brandon makes that argument, isn't everybody selfish in his article?
Right. So she has to sort of have a pre-existing conception of interest.
Valid interest. Can I ask you to digress into another subject, aesthetics a little bit? As a musician,
Aesthetics?
I'm way on to just
Kant's aesthetics?
and Rousseau's, because I understand Professor Haydn, upon reading some of Rousseau's works, started writing in Sturm und Drang style late in his life, and then came back to the classical style. Then
Who?
Beethoven, Joseph Haydn,
Oh, Haydn.
and that Beethoven read a lot of Kant's works.
Mhm.
And I wanted to know, you know, and since he's the perfect cross between classicism and romanticism, I wondered if he had also read Rousseau, perhaps came up with a
I really don't know. I do know that it is true to say that Kant is a kind of a cross between classicism and romanticism, that Beethoven is, that Goethe is. But I don't know the specifics of the influence involved here.
I know that Beethoven, for a while, idolized what he thought Napoleon was as a model of returning order and stability, and simultaneously this romantic ideal of the man on horseback. Then he took it away. He gave credit in the third symphony. The eroica was for Beethoven, and he denied that.
Why did he declare himself emperor?
Yeah.
I think you have to be very careful about any sort of supposed direct relationship between what a composer reads or even thinks and his style of writing, his music. I think there's a sense in which other factors, psychological factors and things like that are probably more important than whether he read or agreed with Kant.
There was a whole movement, Sturm und Drang,
Yeah.
literary and, to my knowledge, Haydn was the first one to put it into music. And it would appear in unexpected places, like for instance the trio of a minuet of a string quartet. All of a sudden the music would sound romantic. And then it goes back to sounding classical, that sort of thing.
Which was written about when? Was written about when?
He went through a period of 5 years late in his life. Could be wrong, I think. Maybe the 1760s, possibly. I have to look at it, but after those 5 years, he went back to his old style. But he wrote, that's when he wrote his 49th Symphony under La Tragedia, La Passion, which is like an incredible piece of, it sounds more romantic than Schubert.
I guess.
George, we need to close up shop.
Yes.
Unfortunately, I know we can keep talking forever.
Okay.
Do you have any last summary that you'd like to?
No last words.
Well then, let me thank you, George, for great work.
Thank you all for participating.
And let me
Very intelligent participation, to say the least.
Let me remind everyone also that we'll be having a forum on Tuesday, Christina Summers, speaking on political correctness in the universities. That'll be at Tiffany Hall. You should all have gotten a flyer about it. If you haven't, let me know.
Tiffany Hall?